Hector Drummond is a former academic, former professor at a Russell Group University. I won't ask which one, Hector. I take it you want to keep that to yourself.
Yeah.
And you are now an author. You wrote The Biscuit Factory, Volume 1, Days of Wine and Cheese. It's a satire on campus radicalism, something along the lines of The History Man by Malcolm Bradbury. Is that fair enough?
Yeah, that sort of genre, yes.
Fantastic. I'm looking forward to reading it. As I said the other day, I'm a couple of books behind right now, but I will get around to it.
Great.
So did your, I take it, your time on campus inform that?
No, not at all. No, it's all complete fiction. None of it bears any resemblance to anything I've ever met.
Yeah, I was at a Russell Group University as well, as a student, not as a professor, but I remember it well. The memories are burned in forever. But now you run HectorDrummond.com, which is a blog recently turned magazine, and it's
Yes.
It's a source of all kinds of naughty information about our lockdown situation, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, the blog's it's kind of taken off recently. Been getting a lot of viewers, and there was a lot of demand for content which I couldn't really keep up with. So I invited people to send their own articles in, and lots of people have sent stuff in. So I'm got lots to publish at the moment.
Is it a constant stream?
Yeah, at the moment it is. Yeah. Don't know how long that will last for, but I always thought it'd be a good idea one day to put other people's content up there, not just mine.
How long have you had the blog? Magazine now, excuse me.
Over 2 years, really. I think it's probably getting on to 2.5 years now, actually. And yeah, I thought, well, there's no point asking people to send stuff in until it sort of gets a sort of bigger following. So this seemed like the perfect time because I was getting a bigger following, and there was kind of too much for me to be able to do myself. So I thought, yeah, this is the right time to invite other people to contribute.
And do you think that might, I mean, the sheer volume of submissions you're receiving, do you think that might be indicative of a great deal of resistance to our current situation among, thinking people?
Yeah, definitely. Also, I think just a chance for people to write articles, because a lot of people out there who fancy the idea of writing an article or two, but don't necessarily want to start their own blog because that's quite a lot of work. A lot of people have started up blogs over the years, and you see they keep it going for 2 or 3 months, and then it just sort of fades away to nothing. So
Yeah,
it's
there's a
nice
lot
to
of
have
work.
somewhere where you can just send stuff in now and then.
Yeah, that makes sense. I, of course, submitted a piece myself, and I was very grateful for the opportunity because, as you say, it can be difficult to find the time to run your own, and a lot of magazines, a lot of mainstream magazines and newspapers are, they don't necessarily want to receive everything that's sent to them, shall we say. Okay, so decided to have a conversation through the prism of 5 pieces at hectordrummond.com, so that people can get a taste of the magazine, and maybe they want to go and have a look at it themselves. I recommend they do, and also for us to get a look at this situation we find ourselves in, this crazy lockdown. So starting with winter deaths, excess winter deaths. You got a piece there, historical perspective on them by it's by you, I think, isn't it, Hector? And it includes graphs by Lawrence Hodge.
It's by me. It's sort of by me and Lawrence, because Lawrence did sort of send me a lot of analysis on this, so it's as much his really as mine.
Who is Lawrence?
Lawrence is just someone who works with graphs and that sort of data. I was hoping he was going to send me some more stuff. Actually, I should get in touch with him again and say, your analysis is very good. Have you got anything else?
Yeah. Well, it makes a fascinating read anyway, because from the word go, what's been striking about this is the lack of context from the government and the media. And we can't just say this is horrifying. We're all so many people are going to die, without saying, well, compared to when.
Yeah, that's right. You've got to look at it historically, especially when it's being said that this is a once in a century disease. Well, if it's once in a century, that should mean that it's way worse than anything we've had for 100 years. But if you look back over the last 100 years, you can see it's nothing like that. And we've got figures. The ONS has figures on excess winter deaths, which is when most deaths from disease occur. And our current levels are nothing like the sort of deaths we had going back into the 70s and 60s, and especially in the 50s. Winter deaths were much higher in the 50s than they are now. I've been meaning to write another article on this, I think, because a lot of the stuff I wrote it early on before people were really looking into this. And a lot of this stuff has sort of come back round again and people have got interested in it. And it was almost like my stuff came out too early, so I've got to revisit it. So I've been thinking this is an important one. I should probably write an article to try and get published, not on my blog, but in a bigger place like Critic or The Spectator or a newspaper. But as you know, getting this sort of stuff in newspapers is pretty difficult.
Why do you think that is?
Well, from my point of view, I don't really have much experience with the newspaper world to start with. So I've sent a few things into people, to editors and so on, but not got any replies. So I don't really have the right connections to start with. I mean, you probably know more about that sort of thing than me. But also I think they're not massively interested in getting stuff from outside people, especially if it goes against the narrative. I think if they want something that goes against the narrative, they would prefer it to come from like a professor of statistics or a professor of epidemiology or someone who's already got a reputation in the field. Otherwise, if they're running something by you or me, people are going to say, well, who are these guys? Why should we take any notice of them? And, in my case, I can say, well, I'm a former academic, but wasn't a scientist, so I don't really have that much credibility, I suppose. I mean, what would you say? How have you found trying to get stuff in the papers? I know you mentioned it's been difficult.
Yeah, I mean, I found that there was interest in my story about. When I say my story, it was basically an analysis of the changes that have been made to the way we record deaths in this country under the Coronavirus Act. Yeah, there was initial interest, but there was certainly a certain amount of, well, who are you? Why should we pay you any attention? And also, I felt like there was an eye on whether or not that's something that the readers would be interested in right now. I mean, it seems that the old tabloid mantra, if it bleeds, it leads, has really played a big role for papers in the last few months. So I mean, they want bad news. They don't want anything which runs against the the race, as Michael Levitt said, to having the highest death toll.
Yeah. So really, for that story of yours to have got into the papers, you would have needed some actual evidence of someone killing people and using all that as a cover, I think.
Yeah. I mean, I went searching. I live around the corner from Stockport's coroner's office, and the former coroner there, John Pollard, was the coroner who looked into the Harold Shipman case. So I went searching for Mr. Pollard to ask his opinion on the situation. So I thought that would give it some weight, but he's retired and unreachable, certainly for me anyway. And two editors at National Sunday papers did say to me that I should find evidence of the clauses causing something bad to happen and come back to them, which, I mean, they weren't put there for nothing.
Yeah, I think that's quite extraordinary, really, because they're pretty important laws, and the public wants to know about things. Yeah, it's not a front page story, sure, but it's something that people should be aware of. I think very disappointing.
Yeah, yeah. So I'm, you know, thank you for giving me the opportunity to get it out there quite early on.
Yeah, well, the other good thing about my blog is, you can, because my blog's not as big as some places, it is a good starting place for people who want to be writers. So you can start off writing for that and then sort of progress to bigger things. So, you and a few other writers have got pieces in the Critic recently.
Yeah,
So it's a
yeah.
nice place to sort of get a few things going. Then you can rewrite them a bit and see what the reaction is and so on. Good place to cut your teeth.
You don't have an insignificant number of people reading it either, do you?
I don't, but I don't have massive newspaper-like numbers. So if you don't do a good a job as you would have hoped, it's not going to matter too much, and you can always rewrite it for a bigger place, tweak it a bit.
Of course.
And sometimes you just need the confidence. I mean, not so much in your case, but for people who are just starting out writing, I've got quite a few of those. It's a good way to sort of start out and not feel too nervous about being exposed to too massive an audience. Although some of my pieces have gone pretty big, so some of my Alistair Hames piece, for example, went pretty big, and so you may get a lot of readers.
Yeah, yeah. I think Alistair's going to get a lot of attention in the future, I suspect, and you too, actually.
Yeah.
I think there have been a few people that, as James Delingpole says, have had a good war, and I think that it'll pay off for them in the long run.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if Alistair wants to be a writer long term or not, but I would like to, not necessarily in sort of journalism, but I'd like to write the occasional piece here and there, as well as writing pieces for my blog. But mainly I'm interested in writing my novels, and I'd like to get back to doing that again. I just haven't had time for ages to write any fiction at all, which is pretty disappointing.
Volume 1 implies more from
yes,
the same series.
There's a volume 2 I've started working on, and possibly a volume 3 as well.
Fantastic. That's really, really great. And did you always intend to leave academia and move into fiction writing?
Yeah, I mean, I was only ever intending to be in academia short term to sort of get established, save a bit of money up, which never happened, of course, and make a few contacts. And I thought it'd be a good job to be able to get some spare time to do some writing. As academia progressed over the years, spare time became less and less, and it turns out you're spending every spare minute basically you're doing your academic work. So it really became a terrible job for being a wannabe writer. But I got sort of stuck in it for way too long, and eventually I just said I've got to get out, otherwise I'm never going to get out.
I understand.
So just bit the bullet, basically.
Well, we're very grateful that you did, because some of this information is extremely important that you're putting out there. Back on this piece again about excess winter deaths, and one of the things that struck me, and actually it's this coincidentally, because you sent me the 5 pieces for this podcast. The one that the first one on the list that we're talking about now is the first one I read on the blog, and I did find certain information that extremely striking, and that the numbers of people build up every year. So we have a bad flu season, and then maybe for a year or 2 years after that we'll have, if you excuse the term, good flu seasons. So you get a build-up of vulnerable people, and that we're in that position now, aren't we?
Yeah, yes we are. Yeah, so last winter, as in not the one just gone in 2020, but 2018-19, we had a pretty good winter in that there were less excess deaths than you expect. So often these things zigzag. So you go from, like you said, 1 year's bad, next year's all right. Not always like that. Sometimes you get 2 years good or 2 years bad, but generally you don't go more than 2 years without 2 good years without then having a bad year. So last winter being, as it was a good one with not many deaths, we probably should have expected quite a lot of excess deaths this year. And we did get a few. Yeah, one thing I realized that blog piece, it isn't totally clear on what's happened over the winter, and I've been meaning to revisit that, and I've been looking through the ONS spreadsheets today for that. So 2019, end of 2019, we had a few excess deaths over the 5-year average, not a massive amount. It was still pretty normal, not massively out of line, a bit on the high side, which possibly was the earlier appearance of COVID-19. We don't really know at this stage. And then obviously we had January and February, bit excess again, but not massive. And then once we got into March and April, obviously that's when COVID really hit. So we've had a lot of excess deaths since then. But before that, it wasn't a massively bad winter. And the winter before was pretty good. So we did have, it does look like we did have a large buildup of people who had survived previous winters, who might not have done so if we'd had a bad winter with a nasty flu going around. So there probably was, you've got to be careful how you put this because you can sound a bit callous, but we probably had a lot of people who were, how should I put this?
Vulnerable.
Who were vulnerable to a bad flu or similar virus, which could kill them. And they'd got away with it, they'd escaped it, but they were still pretty vulnerable if they got hit by something. So a lot of people who were, I guess, a lot of people who were going to die in this sort of situation. So in a way, it's not surprising we've had this sudden buildup of deaths, people who got away with not dying over the winter. Unfortunately, normally they would have got away with that and would have been able to survive until next winter, and they might have gone next winter, but this virus has come late in the season and hit them then. So we've got all these extra deaths in spring instead of winter. But basically, yeah, there was a buildup of people who were vulnerable to dying from a virus.
This is reflected in the average age of a COVID death, isn't it? Which I believe is 81 and 84 for females.
Yep. So it does very much hit old people, and a lot of old people in care homes, and a lot of people in care homes are near death anyway. I think I've seen reports saying it's the average lifespan after moving into a care home is something like 6 months. A lot of people, of course, live longer than that. Some people survive in care homes for quite a few years, but a lot of people don't last that long. So, I mean, I'm not totally sure the 6-month stat. I better check that out. But
I do know that
have
in front of me here.
To care homes die. So, what was that?
Sorry, I actually have here a study I found earlier from the London School of Economics that says that the median length of stay in a care home is 19.6 months. But it's 11.9 for those who are admitted to a nursing bed. So I take it they're
right,
much more critical. But it's
okay. Perhaps I better get you to write an article on this for me.
Well, yeah, sure, I'd be happy to. But it does. Look, I mean, it. Again, trying to be sensitive about this as well. It's not called God's waiting room for nothing. Unfortunately, people who go to care homes, they don't go there, before moving on elsewhere. It tends to be the final leg of their lives, sadly. But this context, when you're talking about the lethality of coronavirus, this context is essential, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, most people are old. Most people have got at least one other serious condition, multiple comorbidities, as they call it. There are some people dying who aren't like that, but there's not many of them. And we can't avoid that. There's always people who die of viruses. There's nothing we can do about that, really. We have to look at the whole thing in context, and that context is that most of these deaths are from people who are very vulnerable to dying anyway because of their age, because of medical conditions, and so on.
Yeah.
And we know that it's a disease that's not very dangerous at all for younger people. It seems to be less dangerous than the flu for younger people, especially people under 40. Flu is actually a bigger killer for younger people.
I believe you're more likely to die of lightning strike.
Yeah. So it's crazy in a way that we've taken these enormous steps, these incredibly damaging steps for a virus which really isn't wasn't worth taking those steps for. I mean, maybe those steps are worth it for some viruses that are really bad, but this was not that virus. This is a virus that doesn't even kill our children. You could understand people being panicking and frightened and wanting the society and the economy shut down for a really nasty virus that killed their kids. But this is not killing kids at all. I mean, there are a few kids, and that's sad, but not many at all. Less than flu. So, and certainly less than traffic accidents. So we've really shot out our bolt unnecessarily, I think, in causing all this destruction for a disease which wasn't really worth it.
Yeah, I feel exactly the same. One of the things that angers me. So another piece here. This is one of your own, which you posted on Toby Young's Lockdown Skeptics blog. This is the real problem with epidemiological studies. It's a very interesting piece, and it focuses on reliability of results from modelling. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, what I mean by reliability, I realise now possibly that wasn't the best choice of words, but by reliability, I just mean that we have some reason, we have some evidence that the models give us accurate predictions, or at least reasonably accurate. May not have to be totally accurate, but reasonably accurate predictions. So we can trust what they say. So if a model says such and such is going to happen in these circumstances, we can have reasonable confidence that that really is what's going to happen in those circumstances. So we need to have that. Obviously, we need to have that with a model. I mean, if a model just tells you something and bears no relation to reality, why should we pay any attention to it? We shouldn't. So if we're going to take notice of models, and if we're going to take them seriously, we need to know that these are models that we can trust, that really are going to give us accurate or reasonably accurate predictions of what the future is going to be like. And that's what we don't really have with epidemiological models, especially Neil Ferguson's models and the Imperial College people. We don't have any evidence, as far as I know at least, that these models do give us accurate predictions. I mean, if they do, they've kept it very quiet. There should be independent reliability tests done on these models. The government is going to destroy the economy on the basis of some models. At the very least, there should be a track record of many years of testing of these models. But all we've heard about Ferguson's predictions using his models is that they've all been massively exaggerating the deaths that are going to occur with various diseases over the years. So it seems that what reliability testing has been done, which has been sort of accidental and haphazard testing, has shown us that we should not trust these models. We should laugh them out of the room, tell Ferguson to go away, and we should have brought in some other modelers who have a better track record, assuming there are any. It's not something that gets much attention, the track record with these models.
And in epidemiology specifically?
Yeah, in epidemiology specifically, because there are other teams around, there are other universities with their own sets of models, and they don't all come up with the same things. I mean, the Oxford people, for example, came up with much less scary predictions from their models for what was going to happen. It's not clear why Imperial were taken seriously and Oxford weren't. You'd think at the very least you would get a few of your top teams in and pull the results together from them and maybe take an average from them. I mean, from what I hear though, from what I can gather, getting these sort of positions where you advise governments it's a very prestigious thing in academia to have. So one thing we mustn't have an image of, we mustn't have this image of an old-fashioned scientist working away quietly in his room or his lab, and a government man comes knocking on the door saying, "Professor Ferguson, would you please come and help us with this?" And Ferguson goes, oh yes, okay, I'd be glad to. I mean, that's not how it works. It's very much over the years, scientists are told they need these prestigious positions, they need grant funding. So you get the very aggressive scientists pushing their way to the top using sharp elbows. They make sure they're the ones who get to the top. So the ones that get to the top are usually the ones that are not necessarily the best, but they're the most aggressive. They're the best talkers, the ones who can do their opponents down. They get to that position, and then they're very much determined to stay there. And they will make sure nobody comes in and takes their place as the top dogs in that world. So with that sort of background, there's no guarantee that the people in these positions are the best people to be listening to. They're the ones who've made sure they get to the top. Doesn't mean they're the best scientists. And it doesn't mean that their model's the best either. And we've often seen in this area over the years that sometimes exaggerating is the way to get to the top, because that's the way you get grant funding in this sort of field. And grant funding is king in academia these days. You need to have lots of grant funding. You need to be able to show, look how much research money I brought in for my department recently. And in epidemiology, it seems the way to do that is not necessarily to produce accurate models. Sometimes it can be to produce exaggerated models, which are making things seem worse than they are, because then you get funding from things like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. You have enormous amounts of money to give away for these things. And those people are terribly worried about epidemics in the future causing mass deaths. So, of course, when they see people like Ferguson predicting mass death, they say, these are the people who are onto the problem. These are the people we need to give money to. And that's why Imperial have got massive amounts of funding from the Gates Foundation. So when you think of things in that way, it doesn't necessarily give you a great deal of confidence in the models. Just because these guys are top dogs in advising the government doesn't at all mean that they're right. It doesn't at all mean that their models can be trusted. In fact, I think it means probably that their models can't be trusted, especially when you look at their track records.
Yeah, it was the AIDS exaggerations which partly brought me to looking at death records. And let me qualify that statement. I'm not saying that AIDS doesn't exist or anything like that. I'm saying that, as far as I'm aware, there was a great deal of exaggeration of the effects of AIDS, especially in Africa, and the World Health Organization was involved in this, and it was motivated, it seems, by a desire to bring in as much funding as possible, and in order to do that, bad news was good news. You know, there's a mega death coming. Millions upon millions of people are going to die if someone doesn't step in, and benevolent Westerners like Bill Gates and Bono and people like this will be eager to pump money into the cause. And you think there may be something going on along those lines here?
Definitely. It's the same sort of thing. It's been going on for decades now, and it was bad with AIDS. There was a lot of exaggeration about how AIDS would spread into the heterosexual population and into the normal population through families and things like this. And none of that turned out to happen. Actually, Anthony Fauci was one of the people who was spreading this stuff at the time. So we're seeing some quite familiar names popping up 25 odd years later.
Yeah, he said that 5 to 10 million Americans would die. I think the true figure was around 50,000.
Yeah. So there's a history of these people exaggerating, and it's not just because their models are exaggerated. It's because there seems to be an incentive for them to get attention by putting large figures on things and making people worried, and maybe making people go, oh, well, if it's such a holocaust of deaths coming, perhaps we'd better give you lots of research money to investigate these things and make sure they don't happen. So the incentives are a bit warped, I think, in this area.
Yeah, the accepted margin of error with modelling isn't equal across all fields, is it? Engineering, for instance, you mentioned in your piece. I mean, you can't, if you're a bridge builder, you can't have large margins of error, can you really? For obvious reasons.
Yeah, that's right. In fact, what you would do is you would build in an allowance for error. So you would say, just in case my model's out, I'll make sure that I'm not sure how much margin they would allow for, but they would allow for a margin of error, I don't know, maybe a few 100%. So just in case my model is wrong, I'm going to make my bridge safer than it needs to be to allow for that. And that's fine with bridges, because that just means you've got to make them stronger. You've got to spend a bit more on the supporting structures and the steel rods inside and good quality concrete and all that. It means your bridge costs a bit more, but doesn't make things ruinously expensive. It just means that you've got to build a bigger, stronger bridge than you would have otherwise had to. So that's no big deal. But you can't be having massive margins for error with this sort of thing, because if you're out by tenfold, that's the difference between 50,000 deaths and 500,000 deaths. That's a massive difference as far as we're concerned, because 50,000 deaths we can probably live with. That's a bad flu season. But 500,000 deaths, as Ferguson predicted, they predicted 550 actually, that's when you start getting governments freaking out and running around like headless chickens and shutting down the economy and so on. So we can't be allowing that sort of margin of error with these models. We need a lot more accuracy than that. And it just doesn't seem that these models do produce anything like the required accuracy. I mean, most diseases just seem to burn out much more quickly than a lot of these models allow for. And you think they would build that into their models, that diseases often just don't burn out. They seem to think you just get their exponential growth forever and ever. I mean, well, they know that that's not true, but they seem to think that the exponential growth phase, or the near exponential growth phase, because it's not literally exponential growth, they seem to think that that goes on for a lot longer than it seems to in real life with a lot of diseases.
Yeah.
So they don't seem to have a very realistic grasp of a lot of diseases, I think, despite being the supposed experts in the field. You very rarely see them saying, this disease is not anything to be worried about. Actually, they were sort of saying that a bit with COVID to start with, but quite a few of them were saying, well, we don't think COVID is anything to worry about. And that seemed to be the response of a lot of governments, including the British government, up to like February. Then, unfortunately, Ferguson came in with his model. And it was partly because of the high number of deaths in northern Italy. I think that's what changed everything, because Ferguson's paper was based upon that. He says in the paper, we've changed our minds now because of the northern Italy situation. That seemed to be what changed everything. And they came in and say, oh, now there's going to be massive amounts of death. This disease is much more dangerous and spreads much more quickly than we thought. So they were actually being sensible for a while, but then it sort of kicked into gear, the old exaggerate mode. And it's probably because if a disease is really bad, if you're in charge of this sort of stuff and the disease is really bad and kills hundreds of thousands of people or millions, and you're in charge, you look really bad. It's like you've let this happen on your watch. It's like you're being criminally irresponsible. Whereas if you exaggerate and say there's going to be hundreds of thousands of deaths and it turns out there isn't, you don't really get into trouble for that. You say, well, it looked like that at the time. We thought better safe than sorry. We wanted to protect people. It's our priority to protect the public. So, okay, we may have got it a bit wrong, but better to have done that to let millions of people die. So there just seemed to be this inbuilt tendency to be alarmist if you're in charge of making sure people don't die, especially if you don't have to worry about the economic side of things, especially if that's not your responsibility. You say, well, that's nothing to do with me. That's up to the government to decide. I'm just telling you what's going to happen with the deaths, and there's going to be mass deaths, so we must act now. So there's always incentive for those people to exaggerate.
Yeah, and there's no consequences, apparently, to getting it wildly wrong.
No real consequence. I mean, Ferguson's been wrong over and over, year after year, and he's still been in place. He's still like him and his imperial team are like still the main go-to guys for the government on this stuff, and they're still ones who bring in massive amounts of funding for their research. So it doesn't seem to have affected them at all.
Yeah. And I believe foot and mouth, his wild predictions about foot and mouth led to a cost of 10 billion, which is a staggering figure. In 2009, he said that 60,000 people would die from swine flu. Nothing like that actually happened. You would have thought that those kinds of predictions, being shown to be wildly wrong, would lead to you're losing a certain amount of credibility, and certainly finding it difficult going forward to gain contracts from the same employers that asked you to come up with the data.
Yeah, well, I guess he doesn't really have a contract as such with the government. He's just on an advisory committee. So I suppose in that case, you can say, well, there isn't a contract. He doesn't have to prove anything. He simply goes to these meetings. It's a very prestigious position, but it's not like a contractor position, I don't think. All he's got to do is say what he thinks. With the foot and mouth, that's interesting because, I mean, officially he wasn't wrong. There was a lot of debate about this. It looks to me like he was badly wrong. But what happened was, because his advice led to millions of animals being slaughtered, he claimed that this slaughter was what stopped there being many infections from foot and mouth. He says there weren't many infections, but there weren't many foot and mouth infections. But that's because my advice was followed. There are plenty of scientists who say, well, actually, if you look closely at the data, it does look like foot and mouth disease was dying out, or at least going downhill, before these measures that Imperial put in place started. So there's a body of scientists who think that Imperial's measures didn't help at all, weren't needed, didn't help, cause enormous damage. But there's also a body of scientists who say, oh no, it was Ferguson and Roy Anderson was the other professor at the time at Imperial. It was their measures which saved us from foot and mouth, saved foot and stopped foot and mouth from spreading amongst our farms and destroying British farmers' livelihoods. So it's not like it's accepted by everyone that Ferguson was wrong on foot and mouth. Because the measures he implemented were followed, he can say it's because my advice was taken. That's why we didn't have a big outbreak. So actually, I was right about that. And of course, that's what he's going to say about coronavirus. He's going to say, well, the reason we didn't have mass deaths is because my advice was taken and we had a lockdown, and that's saved hundreds of thousands of people. So it's only really when his advice isn't taken that we can see that his predictions were way too high, like with bird flu and cases like that.
Yeah, can we just pause for a second on what I think is going to? I agree with you. Ferguson will claim that the lockdown worked. What do you say to people who say, look, the Nightingale hospitals were not overwhelmed, the NHS was not overwhelmed, therefore Ferguson's models worked. Ferguson's models were right, and lockdown worked.
Yeah. Well, I guess then you've got to look at countries which didn't have lockdowns. You do have a few control groups like Sweden and Japan and is it Belarus, I think. There's not a lot of countries, but there's a few countries that didn't have lockdowns. And if you look at them, they didn't have mass deaths. So it seemed, I mean, we have to do a lot of analysis on this. There's going to be a lot of debate about it and a lot of difficult scientific analysis is coming up, unfortunately. But it's looking to me like lockdowns didn't actually do anything and will be shown not to have done anything. So I think we can say at this point, I'd be very much leaning towards saying lockdowns didn't help, lockdowns weren't needed. In fact, it turns out this morning, someone on the Norwegian scientific team has come out and said, actually, we think we didn't need to have locked down. We shouldn't have locked down. It wasn't needed. So there does seem to be a move towards countries, a lot of countries and a lot of scientists starting to realize that lockdown wasn't necessary and lockdown didn't help and lockdown wasn't the reason why there weren't mass deaths. But thank God for Sweden for not locking down, because I think if they had a lockdown, okay, we would have had Japan and a few other countries, but Sweden seemed to be the main one that's been used as a comparison. If you didn't have Sweden, I think probably that narrative would have got through, the narrative that the lockdowns were what saved everyone. I think with Sweden, we should be able to say, no, we didn't need a lockdown. I mean, some people are comparing Sweden to Norway and saying, oh, well, Sweden had a lot more deaths than Norway. Norway is the obvious comparison. I mean, there's a few things I'd say to that. One is that, well, the best comparison for Sweden is Sweden itself. We need to look at past decades of what happened in Sweden. And what happened in Sweden is nothing unusual at all. The amount of deaths they've had. It turns out April 2020 April in Sweden was something like only the 20th worst month for deaths in the last 30 years, I think. So it's not even like this was anything special for Sweden. It might be worse than Norway, but it's a pretty normal month. Well, not normal. It's got more deaths than usual, but it's nothing out of the ordinary if you look at other months with winter deaths going on. That's despite all the the COVID deaths being sort of concentrated in a shorter period than you usually get with the winter flu. Despite that, April 2020 was not the worst month that Sweden's had in the last 30 years, nowhere near it. So for Sweden, you've got pretty much this period of COVID deaths is nothing out of the ordinary at all for Sweden. It's sort of in the range of normal winter flu amounts of death. So there's nothing there that should make you go, we have something terrible has happened here. So people are trying to say that. They're saying, look at Norway, Sweden's been terrible. Say, well, no, look at Sweden's history. There's nothing terrible at all. It's in the normal range of deaths. So the best comparison for Sweden is Sweden itself. And also there are other European countries you could compare to. There's not just Norway. There's plenty of other countries that did have lockdowns, like Belgium, a few other places like that, which had way higher death rates than Sweden. So I think we can say Sweden does show that lockdowns weren't needed. Also, Sweden admit themselves that a lot of their death came from care homes because they didn't look after care homes properly. They weren't sufficiently attuned to that possibility that COVID would get into the care homes and kill a lot of people. I think if they had have taken more care of the old people in Sweden, then you probably would have seen a lot less deaths. You probably would have seen very little at all happening in Sweden, like you saw in Germany. I mean, very little happened in Germany, for example.
It does seem that all roads lead with COVID to care homes and the elderly, and you could say the exact same thing about flu when it comes to mortality.
Yeah. Although flu does kill some younger people more than COVID, but yeah, it is mostly older people near the end of their life who get killed by things like flu. I mean, lots of people near the end of their life get killed by any virus, really, because a lot of people at that stage, their immune systems are not functioning very well, and they've often got other conditions. They might have pneumonia or something else, or cancer, or various things. And basically anything like a cold will finish them off. That doesn't mean that the common cold is a terrible killer that we should be afraid of. It just means that even mild viruses can kill people who are near the end of their lives. Kill in the sense of, be the straw that breaks the camel's back, the last thing that sort of finished the person off, but probably that person would have died soon anyway. Yeah, it doesn't, just because COVID is killing a lot of old people, or a relatively lot of old people, it doesn't mean that's anything the rest of us should be terrified of. If you've got a elderly relative near the end of life, then of course that's something to be worried about, and you have to then think about what precautions you should take and how much you should protect that elderly relative. That's all understandable, but that's a different matter than thinking that this is a disease that's going to rampage through the whole population and kill millions of people. That's just not the case.
Yeah, it's one of the many annoying things about this is that hospice deaths have been included in the data, which is deeply misleading because, of course, people go to hospices to die.
Well, hospice deaths, it's funny because hospice deaths, I've looked at these, they haven't increased at all. Pretty much they're pretty much the same figures that you normally get. It's about 500 a week in England and Wales, and that stayed pretty steady. But they have included some hospice deaths have been counted as COVID deaths, and that is pretty ridiculous because, a hospice is where you go when you're sort of at the end stage of cancer or something like that, and you're about to die anyway. So the idea that COVID killed anyone in the hospice is pretty ridiculous, really. So I think that tells us that, I think hospice deaths reveal that, look, there's a lot of COVID deaths being put down, or deaths being put down as COVID, which aren't really COVID deaths. They're just deaths of people who would have died anyway. They're not COVID deaths.
No, it's deeply misleading, and it just serves to ramp up the fear factor. I have relatives who are petrified. They're petrified. They think that
Right.
that COVID-19 is akin to bubonic plague or the Ebola virus or something like this.
Right.
And it's purely because of the way that the data has been presented, the daily death toll, which the media seems to take a sort of sick pleasure in reporting. The way it's been presented is it's terrifying them, and it's deeply irresponsible.
Yeah.
And it serves to justify this lockdown and this extraordinary removal of civil liberties, which Peter Hitchens in particular, I think, has been very good about, and the economic effects. And you've written here a pretty good piece, which is terrifying, actually. Can we afford to keep the lockdown going until a vaccine is found? Terrifying is the only word, because the numbers are absolutely staggering. I'm just going to read the first few paragraphs out here, because I think people need to, anyone who's on the fence, perhaps. Although I suspect that this is going to be going to the choir. For those people who want the lockdown to continue for a year or so until a vaccine is found, I think the government will just pay the wages of anyone furloughed. Bear in mind that currently 6.3 million workers have been furloughed. Suppose the government pays them £20,000 a year on average. That's £126 billion a year, almost the same as the whole NHS budget. If the furloughed numbers double, which they probably would do if the lockdown keeps going and going, then we are talking £252 billion a year, almost a third of the total UK government budget for 2019, which was £821 billion. These are staggering numbers.
These are just massive numbers, and I think people don't understand how many deaths there are every day in the country. They don't really understand these figures when they see billions this and billions that being thrown about. I think most people don't really have that good a sense of how much money the government has, how much money the government normally spends, how much money the government has spare to spend on things like this. Well, we know, you and I know how much money the government has spare to spend on this. They don't have anything spare at all. Mm-hmm. Government is massively in debt. And here they are talking about spending hundreds and hundreds of billions. It could end up being over $1 trillion. The government budget, I think I said government budget's about 821 billion, something like that a year at the moment, maybe a bit more now. So you can't just go around spending 300 or 400, 500 billion pounds when that's a third to a half of your normal budget. And even with the normal budget, they don't have enough tax money coming in to pay for it. Every year now they're borrowing billions of pounds, sometimes over 100 billion pounds, to pay for the government spending for the year, because they don't have enough tax to pay for it. And that's the other thing I mentioned in that article. What's going to happen to tax income? It's going to drop like a stone next year, because your tax income is coming in from various things like income taxes and corporate tax and VAT and all sorts of things. That's going to be way down. That's going to be much less than it normally is. So you not only have you got an enormous bill to pay, you've got vastly less tax coming in to pay for it. This is just an economic disaster of, talk about unprecedented. It's not an unprecedented disease, but it is an unprecedented unprecedented economic disaster. We've never seen anything like this. I mean, this is like wartime. So this is the sort of problems you have in wartime. And as we know, Second World War, Britain took decades to recover from that. Now, are we going to have that? Are we going to be in that position because of a winter virus? That is just completely insane, I think.
Yeah, I agree. And it is unprecedented because, of course, it's self-inflicted. I mean, you could argue to a certain extent that the Great Depression was in some ways self-inflicted through incompetence, but this is deliberately self-inflicted. And further concern I have beyond the immediate and future worries to do with wealth and the effect it's going to have on poverty is the way that the so-called post-war consensus led to a rapid expansion of the state. And I think that's what we're heading towards now. And that's very, very worrying because the starting point, just when it comes to taxation, is that we have the highest tax burden since 1969 under Harold Wilson, which is an extraordinary place for a Tory government to be beginning.
Yeah, definitely. It's very worrying. And I think you're right that probably we are going to see an attempt to expand the state. I think it's hard not to conclude that there are some elements of the left which were quite happy with all this. This is a crisis that can be turned towards their end because there are certain elements of the left which always like to use a crisis. They say never let a good crisis go to waste. They will use this to try and turn around government and make it even more status than it already is. So we certainly have to be looking out for that and trying to stop it. Not that there's much we can do, really, is there? A small fry.
No. It's quite difficult to be optimistic in that. We've got to keep trying. Have to for our own sakes. I believe that I would like in the future to be able to at least look myself in the mirror and say, you know what, I actually, I had a go. At least I spoke to a few people. At least maybe I wrote a few articles. I'd like at least to be able to say that to my unborn children. Daddy, what did you do?
You have had a good war, Ronan, so far.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Is it pronounced Ronan?
It is, yeah, Ronan. But everyone calls me Ro, so Ro, please.
Okay.
Yeah. So Sweden's Uppsala University. That's a bit of a red herring, it might sound like now, but so they created in when was it, last month? They created a model along the lines of Ferguson's. They're inspired by Ferguson's model and applied it to the Swedish situation.
Yeah, I'm just trying to see what the date it was. Looks like it's about mid-April it came out. Well, it says this version posted 15th of April, so they probably had an earlier version out. So early mid-April.
Yeah, I apologise to listeners that I should really have brought this up earlier, but I do want to cover it because I think it's very interesting, because it shows that Ferguson's models, his software, when applied by others in a different context, also throw up wild results which don't seem to have any bearing to reality.
Yeah, it wasn't actually Ferguson's model. People have been saying this on the internet, but it's not actually his model. They've written their own model, which is inspired by Ferguson's model. So they've tried to use the same techniques. I don't think Ferguson's model was available at that stage, so I don't know how closely they've copied it, because apparently Ferguson has loads of various factors that are sort of written into his model to try and simulate various things. I'm suspecting they wouldn't have done anything as detailed as his, because it looks like they've got it together pretty quickly. But it's the same kind of thing, I think, is the same kind of model as Ferguson. So we can call it a Ferguson type model, I suppose.
Yeah. It's not exactly an analog, but it's certainly heavily inspired, perhaps. Have you got the piece in front of you?
Yeah. So, I have. So, they went through a range of predictions depending on what degrees of social distancing and lockdown were applied. And they predicted far more deaths than actually happened. So they were saying it should have been over 20,000 deaths by now. That was early May. Well, that was over 2 weeks ago now. So let's have a look at this graph. They've got two graphs. They've got one with a doubling of deaths every 3 days and one with a doubling of deaths every 5 days. So mid-May, we're talking, the blue is current, oh, crikey, yeah. We're talking 80, 90,000 deaths by now on the Swedish government's current recommendations on their current social distancing but no lockdown policy. We should have seen a rapid rise from the start of May, end of April, up to like about now, about over 90,000 deaths. That's on the 3-day doubling. On the but even on the 5-day doubling, still talking over 80,000 deaths. In Sweden, we'd had the death toll at the time of writing was 2,679. That will have increased a bit since then, but death rate has been decreasing since then. So I could go and look it up in worldometers, I suppose, but probably we're talking maybe a bit over 3,000. We're certainly not talking 80 or 90,000. So that's an example of this sort of model giving us totally wrong predictions, and not just, I mean, we can't just say, oh, unfortunately that was wrong. That's a shame, isn't it? It's not just a shame. These sort of models are destroying our societies. We're relying on these terrible models which bear no great relation to reality. Theoretically they do, but just because something theoretically should give you the right prediction doesn't mean it does, because the world is very complicated. You can't necessarily assume that your model actually accurately describes what goes on in reality with just a bit of computer code and maths. These models are giving us fantastically incorrect predictions, and we'd be crazy to pay any attention to them at all. All they do is cause terrible damage to society and terrible damage to the economy, terrible damage to our lives for these models which just tell us nothing and get things massively wrong. I mean, this model is not even in the right universe, let alone the right ballpark. It's just so far out of whack, it's not funny. But we've seen this time and time again over the years with these epidemiologists. I mean, I think these people weren't even really epidemiologists. They just want to be epidemiologists. But we see it so often, epidemiologists telling us of these terrible deaths that are going to occur, and time after time, it turns out that it doesn't happen. And I mean, I've been, wouldn't say I'm an expert in this at all, but I've been kind of keeping an eye on these kinds of things for a few decades now. And I just noticed that every time there's a new disease coming along, there's always a bunch of epidemiological modelers who jump on the bandwagon and say, we're looking at mass deaths, we have to panic. While wiser heads who aren't necessarily epidemiologists, but people have seen these things come and go, say, hang on, let's just wait a bit. Let's not lose our heads over this. Sorry, I'm just having a sip of water. And they point out we should wait and see. There's no point rushing into things. I mean, yes, possibly one of these diseases one day really will be a mass killer. And their view is we have to lock down quick and hard, otherwise it's too late. I mean, my view is, no, we need to wait and see. If things really do start to get bad, then we can lock down. They'll say, well, that's too late by then. I say, well, you know, it's too late only if it's really is a mass killer, but they're pretty rare. And I always point out people who say better safe than sorry. Better safe than sorry applies to the economy and society and everything else just as much as it does to disease. Yeah, better safe than sorry applied to disease means, yes, we take all actions possible to stop the disease, but what does better safe than sorry mean applied to the economy? It means we don't just destroy our economy just in case something is going to be bad, just in case we've got a bad disease. You can say that as well. You can say we have to protect, economy is something worth protecting. If we take better safe than sorry seriously, we should say better safe than sorry means we don't shut the economy down, we wait and see. And another way of seeing this is to say, we've got two possible bad outcomes. One is bad disease killing a lot of people. The other possible bad outcome is the economy being destroyed or the economy being very severely damaged. The probability of the economy being damaged is very high. It's pretty much certain that you damage your economy very seriously if you take these measures. What's the probability of the mass deaths occurring? Well, it's not certainty. It's not 100%. It's not even 50%, really, when you think about it. There's a lot of diseases that come up every year. Most of them are not going to be mass killers. Occasionally, one might be. Ferguson's model and other models say it will be a mass killer. But again, they're usually wrong. So it's probably more like 10% chance maybe. I think that's probably a bit high. 10% chance of this bad outcome will happen. So you've got two bad outcomes to weigh up, one of which has virtually 100% probability of happening if you apply the lockdown measures, one of which probably only has 5 to 10% chance of happening anyway. So I would say the rational thing to do, the better safe than sorry thing to do, is to say, we won't have a lockdown. We'll just wait and see, because we don't want to definitely and certainly destroy the economy over something which is merely a small possibility of happening. I think that would be the rational thing to do. And okay, if we don't have a lockdown and it does turn out to be a mass killer, okay, maybe a few thousand people will die who might have not died if we had a lockdown. Although I should point out there that we don't really have any evidence that lockdowns do anything at all, but that's another story. But I would say, okay, maybe we'd lose a few thousand people who might have survived a few more months of their life if we had a lockdown early, but it's not worth taking the risk, because better safe than sorry applies to the economy. Don't take crazy risks with the economy, because the economy isn't just money, meaning you can afford a slightly nicer car and so on. You know, the economy is what gives us jobs and incomes and allows us to survive and buy food and shelter and clothing and all those basic things. The economy is very important. So don't just shut it down for the possibility of a disease being a mass killer. Only shut it down if it's definitely happening and if you have good reason to think that a shutdown will help, which I don't think we do have good reason, but as I said, that's another story again. So I think the Swedish model does show us that, look, just because someone's an impressive scientist with all the letters after their name doesn't mean that what they're coming up with bears any relation to reality. It doesn't mean that we should take them seriously. These are computer models. These are not things that have happened in reality, which the scientists are telling us about. These are things which are existing in a virtual world, and they may or may not bear relation to the real world.
Yeah, this alleged precautionary principle approach, I would have more time for it if they were consistent, and as you've just explained, they're not consistent, because surely, given what we know, the certainties actually we know about economic damage, what recessions, especially deep recessions and depressions, do to human beings and to their well-being, to their life expectancy and so on, then surely we would also apply the precautionary principle to the economy. But that seems to be lost right now. It's everything's COVID, nothing else that matters.
Yeah, and then they say, well, if you put the economy before deaths, you're some sort of terrible person putting money before lives. That's how they spin that sort of thing.
Wealth before health.
I mean, personally, I think the precautionary principle should simply be thrown out. I mean, that's probably a debate for another day, but I think the precautionary principle doesn't make any sense in the end. I think we need to be looking at traditional risk-benefit analysis. And the problem with the precautionary principle is it isn't consistent with the risk-benefit analysis where you take probabilities into account. And various people have tried to give their own version of the precautionary principle where they do take probabilities into account to some degree, but when problems with those revised understandings of the precautionary principle get analyzed and criticized, people putting them forward just end up going more and more and more towards just normal decision theory type risk-benefit analysis theory. I think that you've just got to have risk-benefit analysis where you're looking at the bad outcomes and good outcomes and weighting them all by the probabilities. That's just the most rational way to look at these things. The precautionary principle just leads, as well known, it just leads to inconsistencies. It could just be shown to lead to contradictory positions where all sorts of completely contrasting decisions can be made given the same information. So we really shouldn't be talking about the precautionary principle at all.
Yeah. Well, look, we are a good bit over an hour there now, Hector, and that was very interesting. There's a lot to be thinking about there. Anyone who is interested, go to hectordrummond.com. It's a fantastic magazine, highly recommend it. And I'm going to post this on Twitter tomorrow, and I will put links there to all the articles we discussed. And Hector, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me, Ronan, and thanks for writing that article a few weeks ago as well.
Absolutely.
And hopefully
pleasure.
We'll see a few more from you, not just on my blog, but elsewhere as well.
We certainly will. Thank you. I really appreciate that.